The air in my foyer usually smells like beeswax and the faint, sharp sting of peppermint tea. It is a quiet house, a house earned through 40 years of nursing shifts and double time on holidays. But that Tuesday, the air felt different. It felt heavy, like the humidity before a Georgia thunderstorm. I was sitting in my wingback chair, the one with the firm cushions that support a back tired from decades of lifting patients. When the sound came, it wasn't the polite, rhythmic tap of a neighbor. It was a heavy, desperate thud against the oak. My husband, Matthias, didn't move. He sat at the kitchen table, his hands shaking slightly as he gripped a cold cup of coffee. He didn't look at the door. He looked at the floor. And in that moment, the silence between us wasn't a shared peace. It was a confession. I stood up, smoothed the front of my silk robe, and opened the door. There stood his mother, Bernice, clutching a plastic trash bag and wearing a coat that was far too thin for the March wind. She looked at me, not with the shame of a woman who had been evicted, but with the expectation of a woman who had found her new landlord. Matthias had told me for 3 years that his mother was comfortable in the Magnolia Springs assisted living facility. He told me he visited her every month to check on her care. He told me our savings were being used to ensure she had the dignity she deserved. But as I looked at her shivering on my porch, I realized my husband hadn't been paying for her dignity. He had been paying for a lie, and the bill had finally come due. Most women would have screamed. I simply stepped aside and held the door open because I knew that to trap a fox, you first have to let him think he's safe in the hen house. My name is Agnes Turner. I have spent my life as the spine of this family, and a spine does not break just because the body decides to stumble. I grew up in a house where we didn't have enough for wants, but we always had enough for needs, provided you were willing to work until your fingernails were worn down to the quick. I put myself through nursing school while Matthias was still finding himself. I was the one who calculated the interest rates, the one who negotiated the mortgage on this 4-bedroom brick house, and the one who built a retirement fund that was supposed to be our sunset. I don't believe in luck. I believe in structure. I believe that a person's word is the currency they trade with when they have nothing else. For 30 years, I thought Matthias traded in gold. It turns out he was trading in counterfeit bills, and he assumed that because I am a woman of a certain age, I had grown too soft to notice the difference. The betrayal didn't happen when I saw Bernice on the porch. That was just the delivery. The betrayal happened in the quiet moments over the last 36 months. It was the way Matthias would kiss my cheek before his monthly visits, taking the $500 in cash I gave him to supplement her care. It was the way he would come home and describe the gardens at the facility, telling me how much Bernice loved the roses I was paying for. He sat across from me at dinner every night, watching me track our budget on my ledgers, knowing that he had stopped paying the facility fees a year ago. He had been pocketing the money, funneling it into a business venture with his shiftless nephew, Marcus. He assumed that because I loved him, I wouldn't audit him. He thought I was just a collection of old sayings, not a strategic manual for survival. He mistook my silence for ignorance. I watched him now, scurrying to get his mother a chair, his voice a frantic pitch of, "Mama, are you okay?" and, "Agnes, let's get her some tea." I didn't say a word. I went to the kitchen and made the tea. I moved with a deliberate, slow grace. Silence is a mirror. If you hold it still long enough, people will eventually show you exactly who they are. As Bernice began to complain about the rude people who kicked her out of her room, I realized that Matthias hadn't just lied about the money. He had underestimated the woman who made the money. He forgot that you cannot build a life on a foundation of sand and expect the architect not to notice when the walls start to lean. He thinks this is a family emergency. I know it is a forensic audit. If you've ever been the one everyone relies on, only to find out they've been using your strength as a hiding place for their weakness, stay with me. This isn't a story about a broken heart. It's a story about a reclaimed ledger. The tea was served in my grandmother's bone china, the set I saved for Sundays and anniversaries. I placed the saucer in front of Bernice with a steady hand, the porcelain clicking against the mahogany table with a sharp, final sound. Matthias wouldn't meet my eyes. He hovered over his mother, adjusting her thin cardigan as if a bit of wool could cover the nakedness of his deception. He kept talking, a nervous stream of noise about temporary setbacks and administrative errors at the care home. I didn't interrupt him. I sat in my chair at the head of the table, folded my hands, and watched the performance. When you have spent 40 years in a hospital ward, you learn to recognize the difference between a person who is hurting and a person who is performing. Matthias was a man on a stage, and he didn't realize I was already pulling the curtain. Silence is a tool. Most people are terrified of it. They feel the need to fill the empty air with excuses, lies, and justifications. I let the silence sit in the room like a heavy winter coat. I watched Bernice sip her tea, her eyes darting around my kitchen, assessing the value of my appliances, the depth of my pantry, the comfort of my life. She didn't look like a woman who had suffered a tragedy. She looked like a woman who had finally arrived at the destination she'd been aiming for all along. She had spent her life expecting the world to provide for her, without ever planting a seed herself. And she had raised a son who thought he could harvest from my garden without me noticing the missing fruit. My husband thought I was just a collection of soft platitudes and kitchen table comfort. He forgot that a woman who has worked her way to a head nurse position doesn't have a soft heart. She has a resilient one. I waited until Matthias ran out of words. When his voice finally trailed off into a pathetic, hopeful squeak, I spoke. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I simply asked one question. Matthias, where is the $3,000 I gave you for the roof repair last October? The air left the room. He blinked, his mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled from a muddy creek. He started to say something about a contractor dispute, but I held up one finger. The silence returned, harder this time. I knew the answer. I had already seen the ledger in my mind. I had seen the way he tucked his phone away when I entered the room. I had seen the new tires on his nephew Marcus's car. I wasn't just a wife in that moment. I was an auditor, and the books were not balancing. Bernice set her cup down. Now, Agnes Turner, she said, her voice dripping with that artificial sweetness that always preceded a demand. Family is family. Money comes and goes, but we have to stick together. My son was just trying to help his kin. She looked at the guest bedroom door as if she already owned the key. She assumed that because I am a woman of faith and a woman of a certain age, I would prioritize peace over justice. She thought she could guilt me into a life of servitude under my own roof. But she didn't understand that for me, peace is the result of order, and there can be no order where there is theft. I stood up and cleared the table. My movements were surgical. I rinsed the cups and placed them in the dishwasher. The hum of the machine, the only sound in the house. Matthias followed me into the kitchen, his voice a frantic whisper. Agnes, please. She has nowhere else to go. I'll pay it back. I'll work overtime. Just let her stay for a few weeks until I sort this out. I looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time since the knock at the door. I saw a man I had carried for 30 years, thinking he was walking beside me. I saw a man who thought my strength was his safety net. I didn't tell him no. I didn't tell him yes. I simply told him I was going to bed, and that the guest room sheets were in the linen closet. He let out a sigh of relief, thinking he had won. He didn't realize that in my house, silence isn't an agreement. It's a countdown. When people show you they don't value your boundaries, they are actually giving you a gift. They are showing you exactly where the fence needs to be built. The guest wing of my house was never meant to be a permanent harbor for broken promises. I laid out the towels, the thin ones, the ones I keep for the dog or for spills, and I watched Bernice claim the space as if she were planting a flag. She moved her trash bag of belongings into the corner of the room with a sense of entitlement that made the air feel thin. Matthias was right behind her, fluffing pillows and acting like a bellhop in his own home. He was so busy trying to manage the optics of the situation that he failed to manage the reality. He thought that by getting her behind a closed door, he had contained the fire. He didn't realize that I am the one who built the fireplace, and I know exactly how much heat the house can stand before it starts to burn. That night, the house was full of noises that didn't belong. The floorboards creaked under Bernice's heavy, restless pacing. The pipes groaned as she ran the hot water long after midnight. I lay in my bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the man beside me breathe. Matthias's breath was shallow, the sound of a man who knows he's sleeping on a ledge. I didn't reach out to touch him. I didn't ask him for the truth again. I didn't need to. I had already performed the mental math. Over the last 3 years, the care home, fees, the roof repairs, and the emergency plumbing added up to nearly $45,000. That was my overtime. That was my sweat. That was the cushion I had built so that when we were 70, we wouldn't have to ask a soul for a dime. He hadn't just stolen my money. He had stolen my peace of mind. At 3 a.m., I got out of bed. I didn't put on my slippers. I walked barefoot through the hallway, feeling the coolness of the hardwood. I stopped outside the guest room. The door was cracked open just a sliver, and I could hear them. Matthias and Bernice were whispering. She won't notice. Bernice hissed. Agnes Turner has always had more than she needs. She's stingy, Matthias. You're her husband. That money is yours too. We just need to wait for her to calm down. And then you can get Marcus that second installment. My husband didn't defend me. He didn't remind his mother that Agnes Turner was the reason he had a roof over his head. He just sighed, a sound of weary compliance, and said, I know, Mama, just keep it quiet for a few days. I stood there in the dark, the silence doing the heavy lifting. I didn't burst in. I didn't make a scene. A scene is for people who have no plan. I am a woman of structure. I walked back to my bedroom, sat at my small desk in the corner, and opened my laptop. I didn't look at photos. I looked at bank statements. I looked at the joint account that I had foolishly kept topped up for household expenses. I saw the withdrawals, small enough to ignore individually, but together they were a slow bleed. I saw the transfer to an account I didn't recognize. Marcus, the nephew who hadn't held a job since the Obama administration. They thought I was the bank. They didn't realize I was the auditor, and the audit was now complete. The next morning, I was in the kitchen before the sun was up. I had the coffee brewing, the smell of dark roast filling the room like a call to order. When Bernice shuffled in, expecting a hot breakfast, she found me sitting at the table with a stack of papers and my glasses perched on the end of my nose. I didn't look up. I just kept writing. Morning, Agnes, she chirped, her voice scratching at my nerves. What's for breakfast? I was thinking some of those cheesy grits you make. I finally looked up, and I let the silence stretch for 10 full seconds. Silence is the only language an entitled person eventually understands. The grits are in the pantry, Bernice. I said softly. The stove is electric. I'm sure you can figure it out, while I finish calculating exactly how much this visit is going to cost the estate. Matthias walked in then, his face pale. He saw the papers. He saw the look in my eyes, the look I used to give the interns when they tried to chart a patient's vitals without actually checking their pulse. He knew the game had changed. He thought he was playing checkers, but I have been playing chess since before he knew how to tie his own shoes. I wasn't angry. I was cold. and cold is much more dangerous than heat. By noon, the atmosphere in the house had shifted from a forced hospitality to a clinical investigation. I didn't go to work that day. I took a personal day, something I hadn't done in 5 years. I spent the morning in my home office, the door locked, while the muffled sounds of Matthias and Bernice echoed through the vents. They were pacing. They were whispering. They were trying to figure out if the storm had passed or if the clouds were just gathering. I didn't give them a weather report. I gave them nothing but the sound of my printer whirring. I had spent the last 4 hours tracing every supplemental care fee Matthias had asked for. It's a strange thing to look at a marriage through a spreadsheet. Every $500 he took for his mother's physical therapy was actually a payment on Marcus's overpriced SUV. Every $300 for new linens at the facility was a night out at the casino. They didn't just spend my money, they spent my time. They spent the hours I stayed late at the hospital, the nights I missed sleep to ensure our future was secure. They looked at my discipline and saw a resource to be mined. They assumed that because I am a woman of grace, I would never count the cost. They forgot that grace is a gift, but accountability is a requirement. When I finally emerged from the office, Bernice was sitting on my velvet sofa, crumbs from a coffee cake she'd found in my pantry scattered across her lap. She looked comfortable, too comfortable. She had the television blaring a daytime talk show, filling my quiet sanctuary with noise. Matthias was in the kitchen, pretending to fix a cabinet door that wasn't broken. He wanted to look busy. He wanted to look like a man who contributed. I walked into the living room, picked up the remote, and pressed the power button. The silence that followed was immediate and heavy. It did the work for me. Agnes, now, I was just watching my program. Bernice said, her lip curling into a pout that might have worked on her son, but it hit me like a dull blade. I didn't apologize. I didn't even acknowledge the complaint. I simply laid 3 folders on the coffee table. One was red, one was blue, one was black. I sat down opposite her, and I waited for Matthias to shuffle into the room, drawn by the sudden lack of sound. He stood by the doorframe, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, looking every bit like the child his mother had raised him to be. This house is built on a foundation of work, I said, my voice low and steady. Every brick was paid for with a shift. Every shingle was paid for with a sacrifice. I have spent 30 years making sure this foundation was solid. I opened the red folder. It contained the receipts for the care home, or rather, the lack of them. I had called the Magnolia Springs facility. They had been very helpful. They confirmed that Bernice hadn't been a resident there for 14 months. She had been living in a low-rent apartment across town, while Matthias told me he was visiting her in a luxury suite. The look on Matthias's face was one I'll never forget. It wasn't remorse. It was the frantic, darting gaze of a man looking for an exit that didn't exist. He started to speak, but the silence I maintained was a wall he couldn't climb over. I watched the sweat bead on his forehead. I watched Bernice try to find her sweet voice again. They still thought this was a conversation. They still thought there was a middle ground where they could explain away $40,000 of my life. They didn't realize that when you lie to a woman who has spent her life reading heart monitors, she knows exactly when your pulse is lying. I didn't ask for an explanation. I didn't ask for an apology. I simply told them that the black folder contained the new house rules. If Bernice was to stay in my home, she would be an occupant, not a guest. And an occupant has a different set of expectations. Matthias looked at the folder like it was a coiled snake. He assumed I would just kick them out so he could play the victim to the rest of the family. He thought I would be the mean one so he could be the wronged one. But I don't play the roles other people write for me. I write my own scripts, and in this scene, the cost of the betrayal was about to be itemized. The black folder sat on the mahogany coffee table like a judge's gavel. Matthias reached for it, his fingers trembling, but I placed my hand firmly on the cover. I didn't need him to read it yet. I needed him to hear it. Bernice had stopped preening her cardigan and was staring at me with a look that was part defiance and part genuine confusion. She truly believed that by virtue of her age and her son's marriage, my labor was her inheritance. I let the silence do its work for a long, uncomfortable minute. In a hospital, silence often precedes a diagnosis. In this living room, it preceded a reckoning. This house is a structure. I began, my voice as calm as a morning prayer. And every structure has a cost. Matthias, you told me for 3 years that your mother was being cared for in a facility that cost $4,000 a month. You took my contributions, my overtime, and my peace of mind to supplement that care. Since Bernice has been living in a $500 apartment and Marcus has been driving a new car, we have a discrepancy of $45,000. That is not a mistake. That is a theft. Bernice opened her mouth to protest, to offer some sugar-coated excuse about family helping family, but I didn't give her the floor. I am the chairwoman of this board. I opened the folder. It wasn't a list of grievances. It was a repayment schedule. I had calculated the exact amount Matthias had diverted from our joint future. I had also calculated the market rate for a room and board arrangement in this zip code. If you stay here, Bernice, I said, looking her directly in the eye, you will contribute. You are receiving a pension and Social Security. Starting Monday, 60% of that will be deposited into the account you depleted. You will also be responsible for the laundry, the light cleaning, and the garden. If you are well enough to walk to Marcus's car every Sunday, you are well enough to pull weeds in the yard you're living on. The shock on her face was almost comical. She had expected a guest suite and breakfast in bed. I was offering a job description. Matthias finally found his voice, though it was thin and reedy. Agnes, she's 72 years old. You can't make my mother work for her keep. This is family. I looked at him, the man I had supported, the man I had trusted with my keys and my heart. Family doesn't pickpocket the person who feeds them, Matthias. I replied, and a man who allows his wife to work 60 hours a week while he funnels her sweat to a lazy nephew doesn't get to talk to me about honor. You will take a second job. I've already contacted the logistics company where you used to consult. They have night shifts available. You will work until the $45,000 is returned to our retirement fund. With interest, I watched them both. The entitlement was crumbling, replaced by the cold realization that their comfort was no longer my priority. They thought I would scream, throw suitcases on the lawn, and give them a story to tell the neighbors about the mean, cold woman who turned them out. But theatrics are for the weak. I was giving them exactly what they asked for. A home. I was just stripping away the subsidy. I stood up, picked up my teacup, and walked toward the kitchen. The silence followed me, heavy and clinical. They sat there in the dim light of the living room, two people who had mistaken my quiet nature for a lack of sight. I wasn't cutting them off. I was putting them on a budget. I was setting boundaries that had steel in the middle. When you stop funding someone's delusions, you finally get to see the truth of who they are. The first Monday of the new arrangement arrived with the cold clarity of a winter sunrise. I didn't wake them up. I didn't knock on the guest room door with a tray or a smile. I simply went about my morning ritual, the scent of my coffee a boundary they weren't invited to cross. When I walked through the kitchen, I saw Matthias sitting at the table, his head in his hands. He looked like a man who had finally realized that the bridge he'd been burning was the only one he had to get home. He had his application for the night shift logistics job pulled up on his tablet, the blue light reflecting off a face that had aged 10 years in a weekend. I didn't offer him a word of encouragement. Encouragement is for those who are trying. Accountability is for those who have failed. Bernice emerged from the guest room an hour later, her hair wrapped in a silk scarf, expecting the usual hospitality. She looked at the empty stove, then at me. I was sitting at the counter, reviewing my own retirement statements, my pen moving with a rhythmic, scratching sound that filled the room. Agnes Turner. She started, her voice sounding like a rusted gate. I don't see any breakfast, and the laundry basket in my room is full. I thought we were family. I didn't look up from my ledger. I let the silence do the work for exactly 15 seconds. When I finally met her gaze, I didn't see a helpless elder. I saw a woman who had spent 40 years using her son as a shield against her own responsibilities. Bernice, I said, my voice as level as a carpenter's tool. The eggs are in the refrigerator. The bread is in the box. And the laundry room is down the hall. If you want clean sheets, you will wash them. If you want a hot meal, you will cook it. She bridled, her chest heaving with an indignation she hadn't earned. She looked to Matthias for support, but he was staring at the floor, his silence a heavy, damp blanket. He knew that any word he spoke in her defense would only add another zero to the debt he owed me. He had finally learned that in this house, his credit had been revoked. I watched her shuffle toward the kitchen, her movements stiff with a pride that was finally meeting a consequence. She wasn't used to hearing no from a woman she considered a subordinate to her son's needs. She assumed that my response would be soft, a mere scolding before returning to the status quo. She didn't realize that a woman who has spent her life managing a hospital ward knows how to quarantine a problem. I wasn't being cruel. I was being structural. I was removing the subsidy of her entitlement and replacing it with the reality of her choices. By noon, the house was filled with the unfamiliar sounds of Bernice actually working. The thumping of the washing machine and the clatter of pans were the soundtrack of a shifting power dynamic. I sat in my garden, watching through the glass door as Matthias left for his first interview. He didn't look back at the house. He looked at the ground. He was a man who had been stripped of his illusions, and for the first time in our marriage, he was walking under the weight of his own actions. I didn't feel joy, and I didn't feel pity. I felt the quiet, steady peace of a ledger that was beginning to balance. When you allow someone to live a lie at your expense, you aren't being kind. You are being an accomplice to your own disrespect. Reclaiming your dignity starts with making them pay the full price of their seat at your table. The front door opened at 3 o'clock on Wednesday, and before I even turned the corner, I smelled the heavy, expensive cologne that always preceded Matthias's nephew, Marcus. He walked into my living room with the kind of swagger that only exists in men who have never had to pay their own light bill. He didn't knock. He still had the spare key Matthias had given him under the guise of emergencies. He saw his grandmother, Bernice, standing over a pile of laundry, and his face twisted into a look of genuine offense. He didn't see a woman learning accountability. He saw a source of his own comfort being put to work. "Aunt Agnes, what is going on?" Marcus asked, his voice booming as if he held authority in a house he didn't contribute a dime to. He was wearing a designer tracksuit that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, bought, no doubt, with the care home money. I didn't get up from my chair. I simply took off my reading glasses and let the silence stretch until he began to shift his weight from one foot to the other. Silence is a vacuum. It sucks the bravado right out of a room. I watched him deflate just a fraction before I spoke. "Marcus," I said, my voice low and smooth like polished stone. "I see you're still driving that SUV with the custom rims. It's a beautiful vehicle. I've been looking at the registration and the insurance premiums lately. It's interesting how a man without a job can afford a premium like that." He started to give me the usual song and dance, something about investments and potential returns, but I held up a single hand. The room went quiet again. I don't fund dreams that are built on someone else's nightmare. I pulled the blue folder from the side table. This was the folder for the third party in this betrayal. I've had a conversation with my attorney, Marcus, I said, sliding a document across the table. Since the money used to purchase and maintain that vehicle was diverted from my personal retirement accounts under false pretenses, I have two options. I can file a formal report for financial elder abuse and fraud, or you can hand over the keys and the title by Friday morning. Bernice let out a gasp, dropping a towel she was folding. Agnes Turner, you can't be serious. That boy needs his car for his business. I looked at Marcus, ignoring his mother's theatrics. I saw the moment the reality hit him. He had spent his life thinking I was a sweet old lady who would keep the peace at any cost. He forgot that a nurse knows how to cut out an infection to save the body. The business of living off my sweat is closed, Marcus. I told him, you have 48 hours to deliver that car to the local dealership I've already contacted for a buyback. The proceeds will go directly into the account your uncle emptied. If you don't, the police will be the ones asking about your investments on Saturday morning. He looked at Matthias, who had just walked in from a grueling 12-hour night shift. Matthias looked at the floor. He didn't say a word. He was too tired to lie and too broken to protect the monster he had helped create. Marcus realized then that the bank was not just closed, it was under new management. He turned and walked out, the swagger gone, replaced by the heavy, dragging footsteps of a man who finally has to walk his own path. I didn't feel a drop of guilt. I felt the weight of $45,000 of betrayal beginning to lift. The Friday deadline for Marcus arrived with a quiet, gray drizzle that tapped against the windows. I sat at the kitchen table, my ledger open, the steam from my tea rising in a steady, silver ribbon. I didn't call him. I didn't text him. I didn't send Matthias to mediate. When you give a clear instruction, any further talk is just noise, and I have no room for noise in a house that is finally finding its harmony. At precisely 10 in the morning, a taxi pulled into the driveway. Marcus stepped out. His shoulders slumped under a cheap windbreaker, looking significantly smaller than the man who had swaggered in 2 days prior. He walked to the door and placed a manila envelope on the porch mat. He didn't knock. He didn't look up at the window where he knew I was sitting. He just turned and walked back to the waiting car. I finished my tea before I went to the door. I picked up the envelope and brought it back to the table. Inside was the bill of sale from the dealership and a cashier's check for $22,000. It wasn't the full $45,000, but it was a down payment on his soul. I didn't feel a rush of triumph. I felt the cold, clinical satisfaction of a debt being serviced. I recorded the amount in my black book, subtracted it from the total, and watched the red ink turn a little closer to black. Bernice was watching me from the hallway, her hand gripping the doorframe. She had been uncharacteristically quiet since the confrontation, her usual sharp tongue dulled by the sight of her grandson's defeat. She looked at the check, then at me, her eyes searching for a crack in my composure, a hint of the soft Agnes Turner she used to manipulate. She didn't find her. She found a woman who had spent 40 years determining who was stable enough to be discharged and who needed to stay under observation. "You really took that boy's car, Agnes," she whispered, her voice trembling not with sadness, but with the shock of a predator who had finally met a fence she couldn't jump. "He's family. How is he supposed to get to work now?" I didn't look away from my ledger. "He can walk, Bernice," I said, my voice as steady as a heartbeat. "The same way I walked to the bus stop for 12 years before I could afford my first used sedan. The same way I walked through hospital corridors for double shifts to earn the money he was spending on those rims. Walking is good for the perspective. It gives a man time to think about the ground he's standing on." Matthias came home an hour later, his eyes bloodshot from the night shift at the warehouse. He saw the check on the table and let out a long, shuddering breath. He didn't ask if I was happy. He didn't ask for a thank you. He just sat down and started filling out his own contribution log. For the first time in our marriage, we weren't talking about our money as an abstract concept. We were treating it as the lifeblood it is. He realized that every dollar he had funneled away was a drop of my life he had stolen, and he was finally beginning to understand the weight of the transfusion. The house felt different that evening. The air was lighter, the shadows less oppressive. The elderly revenge the neighbors might whisper about wasn't a fire or a shouting match. It was the simple, devastating application of the truth. I wasn't the villain in their story. I was the editor, finally removing the fiction they had written over my life. The rhythms of the house had changed. It was no longer a place of hidden whispers and performative exhaustion. It had become a place of clockwork. Bernice had stopped sighing every time she picked up a vacuum cleaner, and Matthias had stopped looking for exits that weren't there. There is a specific kind of peace that comes when everyone finally accepts that the person in charge cannot be moved. I spent my Saturday morning in the garden pruning the hydrangeas. The soil was damp and cool against my gardening gloves, a tactile reminder that growth requires cutting away the dead wood. Through the glass door, I watched Bernice in the kitchen. She was preparing a pot of collard greens, her movements slow but intentional. She wasn't cooking for a celebration. She was cooking because it was her assigned task for the day. There was no television blaring, no loud phone calls to Marcus complaining about my cold heart. The silence between us wasn't empty. It was a boundary. I had stopped explaining the why behind my rules, and in doing so, I had removed her ability to argue. You cannot debate a wall. You can only decide whether to lean against it or walk around it. Matthias came out to the patio, carrying a basket of laundry he had dried and folded himself. He looked at me, his eyes tired but clear. For 30 years, I had carried the mental load of this household, the bills, the maintenance, the emotional regulation of his moods. By forcing him to shoulder his own weight, I had actually given him back his manhood, though it was a heavy gift to receive. At 65, he set the basket down and stood there for a moment, the spring air between us finally free of the scent of his deception. I deposited my check this morning, Agnes, he said softly. The full amount. I kept $20 for gas. I didn't smile, and I didn't offer a good job. A man does not get a trophy for returning what he stole. I simply nodded and went back to my pruning. The ledger is on the desk, Matthias. Record it. He lingered for a second, perhaps hoping for a glimpse of the woman who used to soften the blow of his failures. But that woman had retired. She had been replaced by the woman who built the house he was standing in. He turned and went back inside, his footsteps no longer tentative. He was learning the discipline of restitution, and I was learning the luxury of not caring if he liked the lesson. That afternoon, a letter arrived for Bernice. It was from the housing authority. I had spent my lunch hour the previous Tuesday helping her fill out the paperwork for a senior living community, one she could actually afford with her own pension. I didn't do it to be cruel. I did it because the guest room was never meant to be a permanent residence for a ghost. I handed her the envelope without a word. She opened it, her hands steady, and read the approval for a one-bedroom apartment across town, near the library she used to visit. She looked at me, and for the first time in this entire ordeal, I saw a flicker of genuine respect in her eyes. It wasn't love, and it wasn't fear. It was the recognition of a peer. She realized that I had provided her with a path to her own dignity, even if I had to drag her toward it. I suppose I should start packing, she said, her voice devoid of the honeyed manipulation she had used for years. I nodded. The boxes are in the garage, Bernice. I'll help you move on the first of the month. I wasn't kicking her out. I was graduating her from my charity. The first of the month arrived with a quiet, efficient finality. There were no tears, no dramatic apologies, and no last-minute pleas for a reprieve. I watched from the porch as Matthias loaded the last of Bernice's boxes into the trunk of our sedan. Not Marcus's flashy SUV, which had long since been liquidated, but the reliable, paid-off car that represented the stability of my labor. Bernice stood by the passenger door, looking back at the brick house she had tried to treat like a spoil of war. She didn't look like a victim. She looked like a woman who finally understood that my roof was not her inheritance. She got into the car, and as they pulled out of the driveway, the silence that settled over the yard wasn't empty. It was clean. I walked back inside and closed the door. For the first time in years, the air in the foyer didn't feel heavy with the humidity of someone else's secrets. I went into the guest room, stripped the bed, and opened the windows to let the April breeze carry away the lingering scent of mothballs and resentment. I didn't rush to fill the space. I just stood there, appreciating the structural integrity of a life built on truth. Matthias returned an hour later, his face weary, but his posture straight. He didn't go to the kitchen to hide. He came to me in the living room and handed me the receipt for Bernice's first month's rent at the senior community, paid from his own overtime earnings. We sat in the quiet of the late afternoon, two people who had survived a collapse, and decided to rebuild on the original foundation. The $45,000 wasn't fully recovered yet. It would take another year of night shifts and disciplined budgeting. But the debt of character had been settled. I looked at the man I had married and saw him clearly, perhaps for the first time. I didn't offer him a shortcut, and I didn't offer him a cushioned landing. I offered him the dignity of paying his own way back into my respect. He took a seat across from me, and for the first time in 3 years, we didn't have to navigate the minefield of what wasn't being said. I am Agnes Turner, and I have learned that elderly wisdom isn't just about baking pies and keeping the peace. It is about the fierce, quiet power of knowing exactly what you are worth. It is about understanding that family is a circle of mutual respect, not a feeding trough for the entitled. I don't hold on to bitterness because bitterness is a heavy burden, and I have worked too hard to carry anything that doesn't serve my peace. I am not a cold woman. I am a woman of structure, and a structure only stands when the boundaries are firm and the foundation is honest. The sun began to set, casting long, golden shadows across the hardwood floors I had polished myself. I picked up my teacup, the porcelain warm against my palm, and felt the deep, steady pulse of a life reclaimed. I had delivered justice not with a shout, but with a ledger. I had set boundaries not with a wall, but with a requirement for accountability. My house is once again a sanctuary, a place where the air smells of beeswax and peppermint, and where the only people at the table are the ones who helped set it. If you're tired of being the silent engine for everyone else's entitlement, remember that your strength is a resource, not a right. It's never too late to perform an audit on your life and decide who truly deserves a seat in your house. If this story resonated with you, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to Vintage Vengeance. We believe that dignity has no expiration date. Comment below if you're ready to set your own boundaries today. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that their peace is worth the fight.